Okay, so we've been examining the Culavedalla Sutta. This is Sutta number 44. And in the middle-length Discourses, this starts on page 396. Okay, so in the previous class, we dealt with the nature of what is called Visakha, that's identity, which is the 5 aggregates, the collection of the 5 aggregates. And then with the relationship between the 5 aggregates of clinging and clinging itself. Okay, so that takes us through about halfway down on page 397. And now we come to the important topic of what is called identity view. In Pali, this is called Sakkaya Ditthi. Okay, so this is a particular kind of view or perspective regarding Sakkaya. Okay, so Sakkaya are the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. So what are the 5 aggregates? We can't call on the person who knows the name of the wives of the Asuras. Somebody else. Okay. Oh, reading from a book?
I can't do that.
No.
Form, feeling,
Yeah.
perception,
Yeah.
mental formations, and consciousness.
Okay. So it's material form, feeling, perception, the mental formations or volitional activities, and consciousness. And so identity view is a kind of view regarding these 5 aggregates. And it's particularly the view, in a general way we can express it as the view which identifies one or another of the 5 aggregates as being oneself, or which in some way holds to the idea of a self existing in relation to the 5 aggregates. That's the more general way to characterize identity view. But the text is going to explain it in a somewhat more detailed or more elaborate way. So we can look at the text. So remember, this is a dialogue between the Bhikkhuni Dhammadinna and her former husband, who is the lay follower Visakha. So Visakha asks, "Lady, or Venerable Lady, how does identity view come to be?" And then Dhammadinna explains, here, an untaught ordinary person, or we might say an uninstructed worldly person, who has no regard for the noble ones and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, that is, in their teaching, who has no regard for the true men, or maybe more generally the true persons or good persons, the saintly persons, again it means the noble ones, and who is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, regards material form as self, or self as possessed of material form. Or in other words, self is the owner of material form. Or material form as existing inside the self, or the self as existing inside material form. And similarly, he regards feeling as the self, he regards perception as the self, he regards the mental formations as the self, he regards consciousness as the self, or self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as existing in the self, or the self as existing in consciousness. So what identity view eventually turns out to be 20 kinds, 20 views, 20 possible views regarding the 5 aggregates. And so we have 5 aggregates, and each of these aggregates can be regarded in one of 4 ways. We can put this in a kind of algebraic form. Just say X is the particular aggregate. And so for any aggregate, there's 4 possibilities. Some of these might seem a little bit strange to us, but probably in India during the Buddha's time there were a lot of different schools of philosophy and religious thought beginning to evolve, which presented different ideas about the self. And they tried to find different ways to establish a relationship between what they believed to be the self and the visible, concrete, individual personality or individual being. So, like the simplest way to go about establishing the idea or view of self is to identify myself is X, myself is bodily form, myself is feeling, myself is perception, myself is volitional activities, myself is consciousness. And last week I spoke about how, again, I qualify this saying that this is my personal interpretation, it doesn't come from any authorized Buddhist text, but it seems that people with different characters, different interests, will incline to identify with one or another of the 5 aggregates. So the beauty queen or the sports, the muscle man, they will identify more with the body, form as the self. A person with a very refined aesthetic temperament, or somebody who likes to wallow in feelings and emotions, will identify self with feeling. Somebody who is maybe an artist, or can be even a computer programmer who likes to work with ideas, concepts, systems of ideas. Might identify perception as the self, the person of action, a business executive, politician, military man. They would be the type to identify with volitions as the self. And then the thinker, the philosopher, or maybe the mystic will identify with consciousness as the self. So that's sort of simplest level, is to identify one or another of the aggregates as the self. But another way of thinking about the self is to see the self as something standing apart from the five aggregates, and then to conceive of the self as being that which possesses or owns the aggregates. So we can see how this is reflected in our ordinary language. We say, this is my body. And so ordinarily we don't inquire into the implications of that idea. We just take it for granted. It's somewhat, something that just works, and the background of the mind is a tacit assumption, kind of underlying presupposition. So we're always thinking, my body, after you wake up in the morning, if you look in the mirror, you have to make sure everything looks beautiful, right? Even we monks, we have to think, are my whiskers getting too long? Do I have to shave? So we think, do I have my robe on properly? So this is my body. But usually we don't formulate it in that way, but it just remains there and quietly in the background of the mind. But if we go to the doctor and he says, oh, your cardiogram shows defective heart. Oh, then the idea of grasping at my body comes very clearly to the surface. Oh, I have a weak heart. Oh, am I going to live? Am I going to die? Do I need a heart transplant? Oh, your liver is failing. Again, it's my liver, my body. And so when there's some kind of affliction that attacks the body, then we can see the idea, myself as the owner of the body becomes explicit, rises to the surface. And similarly, if somebody speaks a little bit rudely or impolitely to us, we think, or we might say to them, oh, you hurt my feelings. So here we're identifying with feelings. So the idea that I own, or actually we're identifying as the owner of the feelings. He hurt my feelings. So if you don't apologize to me, I'm not going to speak to you anymore. So my feelings have been hurt. Or else if we touch like a hot stove, or we get ill with flu, then we're really feeling miserable, then we think, these are my feelings. Again, then if we have some idea, like in a classroom, teacher calls on you and you present some idea, and then the teacher or other students reject that idea, we say, that is my perception which is being rejected. And so here the identification or the taking of the perceptions or ideas to be oneself, taking oneself to be the owner of the perceptions, this is becoming explicit. Then if one makes some proposal for a project, for a way of doing things, a project for organizing a committee, project for promoting Buddhism, Okay, and then somebody rejects that proposal, then we could say my volition, my will, my purpose, my intention is being rejected. Okay, so these are different ways in which the idea of taking things to be mine comes to the surface. Okay, the third proposition, X existing in the self, this is more philosophical. And this seems to be, it's not so common in the West, but it was rather becoming widespread idea in India during the time of the Buddha, that the self is something vast, immeasurable, universal, and everything in the world exists within the self. So this is a view that's often expressed in a collection of texts called the Upanishads, one of the important texts, the foundations of Indian thought. And so the fundamental idea of the Upanishads is that the real self, our real self, is a imperceptible, invisible, all-embracing universal reality, and that the whole world exists within the self. And so everything in the world passes away and vanishes, but the self always remains eternal, unchanging, immutable. And so here we have everything, including the 5 aggregates, existing in the self. And then the fourth idea, it's an idea that, again, we might not formulate very explicitly, but sometimes if we reflect, we have the idea that there must be something inside me, behind all of the activities of the senses, behind my experiences of feeling, something which is the feeler of feelings, the perceiver of perceptions, the doer of actions, the knower, that which is even behind consciousness. And so we take the self to be existing inside the 5 aggregates, to be the inner nucleus or inner substance of a person. So it's like peeling away, trying to think of a fruit, or maybe it's like cutting through a peach, and then inside the peach one finds the pit. And so the pit, you could say, is the essence of the peach.
Would you say this is akin to the idea of the soul?
Yeah, it's actually very, yeah, that's a good point. It's very much like the idea maybe in Christianity or in other forms of theism of the individual soul as something existing within us. In fact, also in Hinduism, one has the idea of the self as something existing deep within, behind all of the layers of body and mind. So they speak also in the Upanishads of 5 sheaths or coverings of the self. There's physical or bodily covering, the covering of prana or vital energy, the covering of mano, which is mind, mental activity, intellect, the covering of vijnana, which is knowing or consciousness. And then there's a 5th sheath, which is called the sheath of bliss, Ananda Kosha, Anandamaya Kosha, the blissful sheath. And then behind or within the blissful sheath is the Atman, the eternal self. Okay, and so the Buddha speaks about these as views which are held by the uninstructed, ordinary person, one who has not seen and realized the Dhamma. And this factor of, this factor of identity view becomes extremely important in the Buddhist system of teaching. For what reasons? Very important reason. Yeah.
Because of his sort of revolutionary concept of anatta?
Of course that's important too, but there's specifically the Sakkaya Ditthi, or identity view, plays a key role in the Buddha's teaching. Please.
I think it's releasing of each view to the eventual nothingness.
To the eventual.
Of the impermanence, the nothingness, going to nothingness. Releasing each view, each form, each perception, concept, a state of consciousness, releasing it.
Yeah, of course that's important too, but what I have in mind is a specific formulation. We've come across it, I think, in the earlier class.
What was the question again?
What is the specific role, why does this identity view, or Sakkaya Ditthi, play such an important role in the Buddha's teaching? You could answer.
And I can't think of any strict formulation. I mean, yes, it is to be released, views are a
Yeah.
thicket, and it
Yeah.
leads one down into self.
Yeah.
But I think they're looking for a more formulated response from an earlier discourse, aren't you?
Yeah.
This is not coming to me.
Okay, then I have to give it myself. Maybe I didn't formulate the question.
Give it hints.
Okay, I'll mention 10
Uh,
things. Okay, maybe I have to give the answer. Do you know the 10 fetters? Yeah. The texts speak about 10 fetters. These are the 10 things that bind a person to the cycle of birth and death. And then the first of these to be broken is Sakkaya Ditthi, the identity view. It's actually part of the first 3 that are broken together. But I would say that for this reason, identity view, Sakkaya Ditthi, becomes like it's the major cognitive barrier, the barrier to the understanding of the Dhamma. And so the Buddha's, somebody said, the revolutionary view of non-self, of selflessness, is the antidote for removing identity view. Okay, so now there's one question that came from the internet. Person asked, in my example of attachment to the aggregate, who or what becomes attached to the aggregate? Okay, this is an important question. And actually, the question says who or what, and if we take who to be what is attaching, then we're holding to a view of self of some kind. We're taking that there's a self which is attached to the aggregate. But according to the Buddha's teaching, there's no self which is attached to the aggregate, but there is just this attachment or clinging to the 5 aggregates. And that clinging to the 5 aggregates is included within one of the 5 aggregates. It's in the aggregate of volitional formations or volitional activities. So clinging is a particular mental disposition or mental factor, and this clinging or through, this clinging is what becomes attached to body or form, feeling, perception, volitional activities, and consciousness. And so because of that clinging, there appears to the mind the idea that I am a self, or I have a self. And then if we speculate about the five aggregates, then we think that the self exists within the five aggregates, owning the five aggregates, and so on. But there's no actual self that stands outside the five aggregates and becomes attached to them. It's just that the clinging gives rise to this delusion or appearance of a self.
How does the notion of self come to be? I mean, we're talking about it as if it already exists in everybody. But clearly, perhaps in an infant, there is no sense of self.
In the infant.
In the infant. And so what happens that leads
Okay, this is an interesting question.
to have a sense of self?
Yeah. And actually that point about the infant not having the view of self, it's dealt with, or at least it's touched on, in one of the suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is in number 64. Yes, on page 537. In paragraph 3, one monk that the Buddha calls on expresses a certain view about the five fetters, five lower fetters, mentioning identity view as one of the lower fetters taught by the Blessed One. Then the Buddha says that somebody from the outside could try to refute you with a simile of the infant. For a young, tender infant lying prone, lying on its back, does not even have the notion identity, the notion of any kind of person. So how could identity view arise in him? That's the opponent's position. But the Buddha says, yet the underlying tendency to identity view lies within him. So that tendency is there. And sort of looking at it in terms of its origins, we could say that like the most basic factor that envelops the human mind is what the text calls ignorance or avijja, which means not seeing the true nature of things. And so this avijja is already present, in the infant, even though the infant can't have a view of self. But because ignorance is there, we could say that that view of self is lying latent or dormant within the infant. And so once the infant starts to mature and to become a person, then the ignorance, of course, it's still there. And then that ignorance will get activated by different experiences, and then the view of self will start to crystallize. But I think one has to distinguish, I would distinguish two aspects of the idea of self that develops within a child, a developing child. One is probably, what is it? You're a psychologist, you correct me if I'm wrong. What I would call the ego, not in a negative way, but is that factor which enables us to have a sense of our own personal identity in a positive way, and which enables us to mediate between our own needs and the world to form meaningful relations with other people. Okay, so that would be the wholesome or strong sense of, I use the word ego, so it has negative connotations, but this would be maybe the sense of oneself as a person, as a true individual.
Ego doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation.
Excuse me?
Ego doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation.
Yeah, the way it's used in popular, maybe in the psychological literature it doesn't, but in popular usage, like people will say he has too much ego, or he's an egomaniac, or he's carried away by his own ego. So this would be like the negative side of the sense of self-identity. And so in ordinary people, both sides develop together. And to be a healthy person, the negative side of ego has to be kept sort of under control, and the positive side has to be strengthened and enhanced. But normally, in all individuals, except those who have reached some of the stages of enlightenment, there's some idea of oneself as having the self, which one then either identifies with some aspect of the body-mind complex, or else one views as existing behind or within the body-mind complex. And then that becomes the basis for clinging to the sense of what I truly am. And then for the Buddha, that is like one of the root causes of dukkha, of suffering. Okay, any further questions on this? Okay, then, in fact, the way the question is posed here, I have to say, in the beginning of paragraph 7, the way it's translated, lady, how does identity view come to be? It doesn't really answer the question from the standpoint of origins, but it seems more as though the question should be interpreted, what is identity view? In fact, the Pali, it's ambiguous, a little ambiguous. I think it's kattam sakayaditti hoti, so which could be interpreted, or king sakayaditti hoti. Either what is personality view, or what is identity view, or how does identity view come to be. But this really just explains what is identity view. Okay, then we come to paragraph 8 of section 8. This is just the inverse. How does identity view not come to be, or what is the absence of identity view? And then Dhammadinna replies that here the well-taught or the instructed noble disciple who has regard for the noble ones and is skilled and disciplined in their teaching, who has regard for the true persons or the saintly persons, and is skilled and disciplined in their teaching, does not regard material form as self, or self as possessed of material form, or material form as in self, or self as in material form, and so on through each of the other aggregates. So this is how identity view does not come to be. And actually, maybe we could raise a more specific question, how is identity view overcome or eliminated? And this is what takes place through the development of vipassana, or insight. And so through the practice of meditation, even in the early stage, what one does is to objectify each aspect of one's experience simply by noting it, by labeling it, by letting it go. And so normally when a thought arises, we identify with that thought, and then we let that thought flow in and give rise to other thoughts, and then we build up whole reams of stories based on the sequencing of thoughts, interwoven with feelings, ideas, plans, desires, memories, and all of these different strands or threads get woven together to make up the fabric of our individual identity. And so through the practice of insight meditation, through what applies mindfulness and clear comprehension to whatever arises, simply notes it and lets it go. So feelings arise, one will just note the feeling, let it go. Ideas will arise, one notes them, lets them go. Plans, memories, desires, projects arise. Again, one notes them, lets them go. And then one could turn even to what I could call the light of awareness itself, and just observe that light of awareness. And so in this way, one is step by step disidentifying with each of these factors of our experience. And by objectifying it, labeling it, one steps back from it and doesn't get carried away by it. Then as one goes on observing in this way, one begins to see what I would call the flow or flux-like nature of experience. That what we call experience is not the experience of a lasting subject, a lasting entity, but it's a constant succession of occasions of feeling, perception, willing, and knowing, all based upon a physical body, which is also in a process of change. And so through this kind of mindful self-observation, one comes to recognize the mark of impermanence, that all of the factors of experience arise and pass away, arise and pass away. And then as one is seeing them arise and pass away, then one is beginning to get a clear perception of impermanence, anicca. And as the concentration and mindfulness grows stronger, this perception of impermanence penetrates through to deeper and deeper levels, or subtler and subtler levels, until one is able to see the impermanence of the bodily processes, even at what one might call a molecular or atomic level. It doesn't mean that one is actually perceiving atoms, but the speed at which things are arising and passing away intensifies so much that it seems even within a second one is able to observe dozens or even hundreds of events of arising and passing away. And similarly with the mind, the mental activity, when one turns the focus of attention on the mental activity, one sees what seem to be dozens or even hundreds of acts of mind arising and passing away, moment by moment. And so one is getting a very clear perception of impermanence, and then from that perception of impermanence, when it carries deep enough, then one can start turning and seeing how whatever is impermanent cannot be myself. And so everything one is observing is arising and passing away. And so one gives up the identification of it as myself. And then one might think, well, even though whatever I'm observing is myself, but the observer is not myself. Whatever I am observing is not myself, but the observer is myself. So behind all of the changing experience, there seems to be some kind of lasting light of awareness, and that is the self. But what one then does is to, what I call it, bend the light of attention back upon the awareness itself. And then one sees how the awareness is also always arising and passing away. And so one keeps on doing this with each level of reflective awareness. And so one sees both sides of the experience, the objective portion and the subjective portion, arising and passing, arising and passing. And because they're both arising and passing, then one cannot take them as self. So eventually, as one develops this insight into the selfless nature of the aggregates. It's said that one reaches a certain point where one fully penetrates through all the selfless nature of all conditioned phenomena, and then momentarily realizes the unconditioned, which doesn't arise, that which doesn't arise and pass away. And when one makes that breakthrough, that's called the breakthrough to the truth of the Dhamma, then the idea of self falls away completely. And at that point, the fetter of identity view is broken. Okay, any questions on this portion of the sutta? Okay, this is a question, is it possible for the mind, we would say for a person to have sensual desire or ill will if one has totally eliminated the view of self? Yes, that is possible, because the view of self, it's a kind of cognitive idea. And so the person who breaks through the view of self completely, or eliminates the view of self completely, is what we call the stream enterer. This is the person who's reached the first stage of awakening, the first stage of enlightenment. But this person hasn't yet eliminated all of the mental fetters or afflictions. And so even a person who's a stream enterer, or even at the next level, the once returner, can still have sensual desire and ill will. Though, of course, they'll be weaker than that in an undeveloped person. But it's only at the third of the four stages of enlightenment that sensual desire and ill will are eliminated. Okay, this gets a little complicated. I often hear people say the Buddha actually never said that there isn't a self. He only said to see things is not self. Can you comment on this? Yes, this is actually true. It's actually true. The Buddha doesn't say explicitly there is no self. So it's in a way to say there is no self is to set up something like a theoretical position. So the Buddha always takes a very practical approach. Or at least this is the way I understand him. What he says is to contemplate or to observe all phenomena as non-self. So the root of the problem is that we identify things as being I and mine. And usually what we identify as being I or mine are the five aggregates. And so the Buddha's way of instruction is to point out that the five aggregates are not the self and not the belongings of a self. And so see, contemplate the five aggregates as not mine, not I, not myself. So that's what I would call the practical approach of the Buddha. Okay, would the Buddhist mind-only school or the school of Buddha nature have the view that all existence, I see the third position, that X exists in the self. The self-nature generates all existence is in the Platform Sutra, that is the Sutra of Huineng. It seems to me that all schools of Buddhism that I know of reject the view of self Though sometimes the language in the mind-only school can seem a little bit similar to that of the language in Upanishads or Vedanta, but at least explicitly they are committed to the idea that all phenomena are non-self. I'm in no way an expert on this particular school, so I can't comment authoritatively on it. Okay, please.
I have a question,
Yeah.
a general question.
Yeah.
And you're referring, as you said, to the cognitive view of self.
Yeah.
The arising of the cognitive view, as you brought up
Yeah.
the babies. But speaking as a mother
Yeah.
who was present at the birth of the baby, it seems to be the case that there is a primal view of self that exists right from the moment of birth.
You mean in the infant?
In the infant, in
Yeah.
human beings. And
Yeah.
what I've observed, and to quote D.W. Winnicott, for example, that a mother's job is to bear the rage of the infant. There's a rage for life
Yeah.
and a grasping
Yeah.
at life that appears with the first breath.
Yeah.
And it is, in a sense, they're only seen to be selfless when everything is going their way.
Yeah, so it's non-cognitive, so it's not really like an explicit view of self. But what I would say is that the tendency to the idea of I is there, and so if it's frustrated or countered in any way, then it gets activated.
Yeah, and this grasping is
Yeah.
very, very fierce right from the start.
Yeah.
Speaking as the object of that grasping.
I guess it depends on the child. Maybe there are some infants who are very calm. Maybe an infant who's been a yogi in a previous life.
Possibly.
There's stories that I've read about how maybe these are people who became saints later in life, and they come out, all the relatives standing around are very astonished at how calm and tranquil the baby is. Nothing seems to disturb the baby. Yeah, okay. Did you have a comment, David? Maybe take the microphone.
I was just thinking that in order to get to the point of accepting a kind of non-self,
Yeah.
one would have to be much older. It's a kind of complex notion, because I think the more natural state is to experience self.
Yeah.
One would not be able to experience a non-self until one had developed cognitively enough to make that kind of separation. So you couldn't really have anybody until, let's say, the middle of their adolescence begin to deal with it, if even at that point. Adolescents are very self-involved.
Well, I think by middle of adolescence, already the idea of self is, especially in America, pretty solidly established.
I mean, cognitively.
Maybe not in a reflective way, but certainly in a way that's in an operative way. I was going to say something, and it just came in. I think it was relating to the idea of the idea of the cognitive self. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person has a kind of philosophical view of a self, and is actually sort of sitting down at his desk with paper, a notebook, and a pen, and writing. When I reflect deeply in myself, I can see how I'm not the body, I'm not the feeling, I'm not the perceptions, but certainly that which knows, that which thinks, that must be the self. Not necessarily in that case, but it just means that the idea of a self is formed to the extent that one tends to identify explicitly in one's thinking with things. in one's day-to-day interactions with other people and the world. And then, yeah, the other point that I wanted to bring up when you were speaking about the need to have an idea of self in order to overcome it, that there are two ways in which you could say people have an undeveloped idea of self, or maybe two ways in which people can operate without a developed idea of self. One is people who have an underdeveloped idea of self. These would be people who are maybe subject to schizophrenia, or to, what are some of the other conditions?
But you can be very retarded or intellectually undeveloped.
Yeah, but there are people who could even be well developed intellectually, not mentally retarded, but there's still not a complete, like, healthy unification or solidification of the personality. And so for that person, a person like that, it's usually said that this type of Buddhist philosophy of non-self or meditation on non-self is not recommended. Because what that person has to do is to overcome this dissolution, to overcome this ununified aspect of the personality, this multiple personality or unsolidified